Hello everybody. I am in the mailbox and this is Hemlocks. Now you're probably sitting there wondering, Mittens, what is a Hemlocks? And dear viewer, that is a good question. You don't get to know. See ya. Hey, wait, before you go. I'm joking. I'm joking. Of course you get to know. The problem is, where do I start? You see, Hemlocks isn't some late-night high school paper due the next morning for your creative writing class. Oh no. This is a story 2.5 years in production, with a cast of 17 characters, rival gangs, world building, and the best part is, it's set in the 1900s. You don't want to know how many times we had to look up references of clothes from the 1920s. Everywhere I go, they follow me. I have dreams of them, nightmares of them. They're always there. I'll never escape them for the rest of my life. But anyways, Hemlocks is a very special part of my life, and the crazy thing is, it's not even finished. We're drafting out the story and finalizing the arcs within, but that's not to say there's nothing worth it in the rest of its runtime. Today, my goal is to teach you about the story, the world of Hemlocks and its characters, and show you the process we took to get here and how that shaped the project moving forward. We'll discuss the iterations of the backstories, designs, and personalities of the main cast, diving into the various plotlines and relationships that developed with them. And finally, we'll talk about where the project is heading, ideas of future endeavors and ways to share the story, and how we've managed to keep it going this long. So without further ado, allow me to guide you into our little corner of the internet, and show you a project 30 months in the making. Welcome to Hemlocks. So, now that you've all been introduced to it, let's start off with the biggest question. What is Hemlocks? Hemlocks is the story of two gangs in the year 1920, involved in NYC's drug industry to become the top dog, along with the interactions, comedy, and angst involved with that. It's currently run by and managed through a group of friends, acquaintances, and lurkers, made up of yours truly and about 15 or so others. How was the project formed? Well, the idea for the project came around back at the end of May in 2020, which at the time was shared to us through one of Hemlock's founders, Kobe, and his old Discord server. It came from him and his sister Coley out on a walk, discussing what it would be like if the current mod team were a mob gang themselves, and once they got back, they shared the idea with them. This would lead to the first drawings from the newly named Modfia, as well as the beginning of the second game, named the Notfia, through two regulars in the server pitching ideas to each other. However, this was nothing new for the people of the server, as a few other AU ideas had been pitched before and after this one, and all of those had quickly lost interest within a week of inception. A little bit of art and a few loose ideas made a fun one-day challenge to be sure, but it hadn't formed into much else. Yet, that, dear viewers, would come in the next morning from none other than Coley. Again, she'd spent the previous night and the morning of finishing the first group photo of the mods, as a fun little collection of everyone's characters. That's where it really starts. This would be the jumping off point for the Notfia to really form into the Nodfia, the now rival gang to the mods. And who would lead this new gang? Me. Once I saw that poster, I pulled out my sketchbook and drew faster than I ever had before, and before long a channel was made to contain the project, and I would now be helping with it. Over the next few days, we'd gather even more members into the group, and as new ideas started to form, the beginning of our new Mafia-based project was made. As the project began to grow far past anything we predicted, some of the early contributors would leave the project, which, fair enough, it was way beyond a small drawing challenge at that point. As the years have gone on, we've added in a handful of others into the group to bring their own characters and ideas, some more recent than others. The most interesting part for me has been watching not just the people behind Hemlocks, but the story itself grow and change with us. We'll get into a lot of this later, but aside from a few key points that have stayed the same throughout our 2.5-year journey, almost everything has been revised, added onto, changed, or removed. Hi, sorry I didn't see you there. Well, since you're here, it's time we move on to the biggest and most complicated section of this entire thing. And no, I do not say that lightly. This is the storyline of Hemlocks. The story opens in New York, set in the year 1920. We're thrown immediately into the action as we find ourselves in the streets mid-heist, and we meet the Red Moons. Kane Hamilton is the leader of the gang, with his sister Claire as second in command. Under them is Alexa, Alice, O, Manic, and Vivi, a team assembled for their skills and unique styles that help in defeating the enemy and opposing teams successfully. The group walks away back to base laughing at their ease as we transition to the people watching them from afar. Here we meet Nightwalker and Ike, Knight performing reconnaissance and Ike scribbling down information into one of the various notepads attached to him. From then on, we learn Knight is the leader of the rebellion gang named the North Stars, and the Moons are one of the major powers in the city's underworld. The North are fighting to take down the big gangs like the Moons, and Ike is an ally in the standoff as an extremely powerful info dealer of the city. He wants to see the Moons fall, and Knight has been helping him achieve that. Shortly after, we meet the rest of the North, made up of Skylar, Fern, James, and Chris, a mishmash of various skills and figures that, despite their appearances, have been quite successful at taking down players in the fight for control. The gang regroups as they head off to prepare for tonight's heist, Ike following close behind. During the heist, we get a glimpse into the unity and bonds between the members and how they operate, and they finish off the heist successfully. We follow them back to the North's base where another ally, Apollo, is waiting for them and begins to treat any wounds they gathered during the day's missions, Ike waiting impatiently near the door for his payment. Knight, now properly introduced as Calico, hands him the payment and a pair of train tickets, wishing him luck on his travels abroad as she herself leaves the base for the night. She meets with a tall, shadowy figure as we follow Ike through the winding streets on his way to the Moon's base to pick up Alexa, planning to leave the following morning with her to finally escape the city and his various enemies. We see him reminisce over the childhood they shared, the years he holds close to his heart as the screen fades to black. We hear voices as the screen fades in, the riverside quarantine off as we see the lifeless body of Ike floating, the police rushing around and calling out for the murderer behind this crime. We open to a messy bedroom and the sound of an alarm clock ringing away. Alexa wakes up to loud knocks at the door, finding herself alone in the apartment she shared with Ike, confused at his absence. We learn Ike never came home last night and left his things there, very unusual for him, and she assumes he locked himself out. Unfortunately, she finds Roy, a detective for the police, on the other side of the entrance, and she pettily ignores their questions and slams the door back on their face until they stop it with their foot. They tiredly explain her name was in Ike's file and she needs to come with them. She asks why, and they tell her Ike was found dead last night, and the world loses its grip on reality. We find Alexa at the scene of the crime with the Moons, Claire attempting to comfort her while the rest look around the scene for any evidence of what happened. O is surprisingly quiet for his usual behavior, until Vivi finds pictures of the North on a heist scattered around underneath where his body was, along with a notepad of various dealings they had performed more recently. She informs the group about it and gives Kane orders to investigate further into the North's behavior, noting that Ike had ties with the big gangs and was directly opposing the North's rise to power. If they had killed him to break his control in the city, they'd be willing to go much farther if not stopped. The gang heads back to base to begin scanning the city for answers, planning to contact some allies to aid in their searches. Once gone, however, the North slips out from the shadows, eavesdropping on the conversations to try and hear any confessions or clues that might be said. The group searches the area as well, finding nothing new until Roy approaches them with pictures of faces we don't recognize in their hands. Roy explains they found them before the Moons arrived and hid them away, knowing the North would show up at some point after hearing the news. Callie, seeming shaken by the sight of the photos, questions their motives and reasons for this offering, finding a response from them that Ike was a very important character to the police force in the cities. With him gone, they had lost a valuable infiltrator and were farther in the dark on the gangs around the cities. Roy was offering up their help in the case of his murder to make sure things were figured out, and maybe even help take down the gangs they fought against. With much deliberation, the North decides to add them on as an ally, hoping the resources of the detective come in useful as they pull apart the evidence. The gang sets their sights on the Moons, knowing the power Ike held and the threat he posed could have led someone to snap and take him out. As they leave with the plan in mind, Callie finds the train tickets still in his hands, signs of being held tightly creased into them. A sad expression crosses her face as she takes them from his hands and puts them in her pockets, running to catch up with the gang. The gangs begin to search around for the answers on who killed Ike, the Moons working with their fellow gangs to find holes in the North and the North working with Roy to snuff out the Moons. This brings them closer to each other until one day the North find themselves out and about, hanging out around Fern's casino before being ambushed by the Moons, who descend down from the buildings onto them. We then get a chase scene across the city as the North split up and lead the Moons astray, having plans for this occasion to break up the opposing team and escape safely. Here we learn of Alexa and Fern's frenemy bonds, toying with each other as well as the despise Kelly has to Vivi and her skills. Unfortunately, it ends up cornering them along a riverbank and the group fight amongst themselves, shedding a bit of blood and words as the blames for his death scatter across the field. The fighting eventually breaks up with a thick air of hostility, and Kane tries to point the blame onto the North, declaring them to be the ones guilty as Callie holds up the train tickets. She retorts how she gave him these tickets that he planned to use the next morning, and that he had asked for them himself. She had no reason to suspect anything would be against them and was not to blame for his death. He had worked for them on his own will, and that they were the ones to blame. Kane responded similarly, that Ike was an important asset to many gangs around the city, including himself, and that nothing would cause him harm if he didn't do anything to earn it. With more to say but held back by Skylar, Callie retreats to go find the group their safety and get patched up, while the Moons return to base. Alexa watches the events unfold without as much as a word, and finds herself for some reason agreeing with the North. She becomes more and more paranoid at the group around her and spends hours by herself in her apartment, trying to figure out who took him away before storming into base and loading a gun, demanding she know who did it before she killed the entire room. A fight breaks out among the group as Alice holds her back from causing any harm and Claire tries to soothe her, the woman becoming more angry as she ripped at the limbs holding her and began tearing at Manic's arms. And then a single shot is heard in the building and everyone stops. O steps forward and admits the murder of Ike, recounting the night as it happened. Ike had arrived at the Moon's base to finish up his latest assignment, putting his final touches on everything to ensure he could leave with everything he worked on the next day. As he left, O had followed him and the two got into an argument, leading to Ike giving the cold, raw exposure of the emotions O always hid inside behind his mask. And that made him angry, made him feel weak and vulnerable, so he strangled him to the riverbank and drowned him to keep his secret safe within, planting evidence as he could to mislead anyone who tried to find him. Alexa had to be held back as she screamed in raw anger and agony, the words emerging from her mouth more vile than anything anyone had felt for a long time. Alice wrenched the gun from the shaking lady's hands as she punched O to the ground, landing a few more punches as she ran away, swearing off all ties with the Moons and leaving a crack in the mask O held dear. An unknown figure closes up shop for the night as he hears the distant screams crossing from one sky to another, and something about it makes the world spin. Collisions are going to be happening again once it seems. Over the next few days, the news spreads like wildfire, and everyone learns the Moons are behind the murder of Ike. The North is expectedly unsurprised at the news given their original doubts, but for Callie the news only deepens her worries. She pulls out the photos Roy gave her and she takes off the mask for the first time, the worry covering her now exposed face. We learn the photos of the full faces of her, Skylar, and Fern, and the lengths taken to cover them up appear to not have been enough to stop the invasive info dealer from taking the photos. She shares the news with the gang and we discover why such lengths have been taken. The trio, while remaining vague, have been involved in previous gangs before starting the North, and information these photos could hold could lead some very heavy consequences if the world figured out who they were. So the group began planning. Knowing Ike, they reasoned if they weren't the only ones he would have taken. If they could figure out where he had left all of his information, they could find a way to destroy any other evidence they found. On top of that, they knew he had worked with many gangs, and now confirmed the Moons as well, so it might just be the advantage they needed to succeed in the stalemate. Roy offers a tip they were given around a year ago about the rumors of a bunker, a sprawling complex of notes, names, and photos, full to the brim of information about the lives of everyone who passed through the city. They decide to search around for any hints they can find, retracing his usual paths to try and test how real such rumors could be. The Moons, now down a very important member, begin working extra hard to fulfill the duties they had become accustomed to. Manic, Vivi, and O go out on missions to secure more funding for the gang, and Alice and Claire manage the lower-ranking members to ensure supplies and resources are flowing in normally. We learn of the ladies' secretive romance with each other, watching them flirt and seeing Claire's aura of positivity affect Alice more clearly than against opponents in battle. Before long, they're called up by Kane to deliver the reports, and we watch them share a quick smile before walking up together. The mission trio of the Moon zoom through the streets as they avoid the cries of a group on their tails, laughing to each other as they cheer another success in the bag and return to base. They recount the impressive parts of the outing and high-five each other as they exit the vehicles, Vivi leaving the pair by themselves as she walks in to give the bags to Kane. This, however, is a short moment of escapism as we see O's smile slowly fall from his face, turning away from Manic as his hands begin to shake with guilt. Manic approaches him about it and O masks the emotions he feels, but the conversation steers towards the loss of Ike and Alexo no matter their efforts. We catch glimpses of O's shame and guilt at his actions, seeing the cracks in his persona starting to appear as he tries desperately to hope things will turn out fine and the loss of those he considers close will stop here. Manic makes him laugh to cheer him up, but after 2 years of knowing him, he knows the pain runs a lot deeper than he can fix. The North eventually arrives at a bar, all their points of evidence leading them to the owner of the establishment, Eden Murphy. They interview her and we learn she was a good friend of Ike's for years, helping him manage the bunker as needed and keeping it safe from prying eyes. After refusing to budge even the notion of trying to take down gangs like the Moons, Callie takes off her mask for Eden to see, and she suddenly stops and changes her tune. She mentions a name ending with Ember, and begrudgingly gives the gang a clue on the whereabouts of the bunker. We see Eden look at Skylar and Fern for a brief moment with a hint of surprise as she wishes them safety, Callie thanking her for the help as they leave in search of the clue. As they search, we transition over to the Moons and into Kane's office, where we watch him collaborating with many figures resembling leaders of other mafia gangs in the area. He makes deals, laughs and jokes with them, even pours a toast, and before long it's over and the man smiles to himself. In his hand we see contracts of temporary alliances for unknown reasons, and before long Kane comes in to give Claire a new report on the day so far. He seems happier than he has been in the story so far, and Claire picks up on it, asking him what's got him in such a mood. He simply responds that times are going to be changing very soon, and his plans might in fact be successful again. Something about the way he says it bothers her. But she has better things to do than question his choices. Claire leaves the office with a messy notepad in hand, responding that if anything goes wrong, to not call her. The North follow the clues through a series of events that lead them to another gang, who have another clue in the bunker's whereabouts. We watch the North battle it out with them to get the info they needed, taking a few beatings as they return victorious. Back at base, they begin to piece together the location using the clues they've gathered as they recover, and James asks why they're going through so much effort for this. He explains he understands the reasoning for gathering intel to take down the top gangs, but wonders what could have been so bad that they have to live in the shadows. The three look at each other and Fern lets out a sigh, saying they were going to ask eventually, and so they stand up together and turn around. Red moons. That's all the gang can think of when the trio shows the back of their shoulders and a pattern emerges from their skin and fur. The mark of the Moons. A branding burned into any traitor who is set to die for their crimes against the Moons. Callie gives the true story on how the North came to be, and it all started with Kane. Kane had hired them all into the Moons years before this had all occurred, and they had lived their lives quite contently for a few years as they became the strongest group in the city. Skylar reunited with an old friend, Fern became friends with Alexa, and Callie built a friendship with her mentor, Claire. Her fire had burned a terrifying yellow back then, and she had been known throughout the state as the Quiet Ember. The gang murmurs at the mention of the name, remembering the figure who had vanished a few years back. And they continue. This began to change when she stumbled into Kane during one of his alliance meetings, drafting up contracts for other gangs to sign. Kane had welcomed her in to watch him take control of the allied bosses, and Callie reveled in the feeling until later that night. Upon the decision to read the agreements again to feel that sense of control, she realized the price such bindings could have to the Moons if things went wrong. She dug deeper into the alliances and stayed up late through many nights to find the clauses of betrayal soared higher and higher, and Kane priding himself on the strength of his gang to finish anyone off if things were found out. Instead of feeling control, Callie began to feel fear. Fear that her boss had put the entire gang in jeopardy and her family was in danger. She tried desperately to find reasons to ignore this, working harder on missions than ever before and emptying her thoughts to Skylar and Fern. But it was no use as she looked up at the man gambling their lives for the sake of his own gain, and when he looked down at her, all she saw in his eyes were the silhouettes of the people who gave her life meaning. Reluctantly, Callie rallied Fern and Sky together to try and end the deal against his wishes, noting if they could break off the ties, they could keep the gang safe for a little longer. Though successful in their attempt, Kane took this as an act of treason against the Moons, and they were branded for their crimes. They would escape their death sentence just barely with the sacrifice of Fern, who was revived at the cost of the horns and fire abilities he now possessed, and managed to fake their deaths to the entire criminal world a month later. Fern's casino became their sanctuary as they pieced together a network of trades to keep the trio alive, and with the entrance of Ike into their lives, they were able to officially start the North Stars Rebellion 6 months later. That was why the masks were so important, that was why they always planned ahead, and that was why the bunker needed to be found. There was a moment of silence as the three looked onto the gang and their allies warily, the secrets now out to those closest to them. The other members united under the new info as the cause became more clear to them, and Callie let out a sigh of relief that they had finally been able to tell them about it and no one else would know. We then transitioned to Kane's office once again, and we turn to face the door as Roy walks in and shakes his hand. We learn Kane had hired Roy to watch the North for any unusual behavior, finding out any information he could to keep the Moons one step ahead of them. This was how the original fight had happened, and we watch as Roy shares the photos and identities of the North's leaders to Kane. We see a moment of pure, unbridled disbelief on his face, before being masked with a smile as he rushed the doorstep. He shouted at the gang to prepare for a brawl with the North Stars the next morning as he rushed the telephone to contact his allies, watching him dial various numbers as we fade away. The next morning arrives and the North Stars meet together in the base, piecing together the clues they've found and circling the location they need to check for the bunker. As they drive, the streets seem a little emptier than usual until they're flanked on both sides by another gang, and they split their vehicles down opposite roads. A chase ensues on both of the North's tails as they speed across the city to try and outrun the multiple gangs which have teamed up against them. After shaking them off their tail and reconvening at James' shop, they set off on foot down the roads and are eventually cornered by gangs. After being circled in by the Allies, Kane emerges with the Moons behind him and orders the Allies to hold the North in place. There's cheering around the area as they celebrate the capture of the evasive rebellion, holding the members back so they cannot move. Kane enters into a speech about how he's waited for this day to come and ready to get rid of the last big thorn in his side, before suddenly ordering the Moon members to be held back too. With confusion and panic, they are also held back, and Kane goes into the real reason they're here, to kill the North and expose them for who they really are. Their masks are removed forcefully, and Callie, Sky, and Fern identities are revealed to the city once more. Gasps are heard from O and Claire as they recognize the friends they lost and watched die, and Alice sees the face of her partner staring back in fear. Callie begins to panic at the sight of the Moons and Kane, and Skylar tries to remain calm against the massive eyes staring at him, the feeling of those eyes reminding him of his past. Kane enters into another speech directed at Callie, saying he's surprised she made it this long without detection, but how she should have realized he'd find her again no matter what. Callie angrily responds that she tried to save the gang from him, and all he's done is bring the gang down with his sick mind. This angers Kane, and he tells the Allies to let her go so he can finish her off himself. They throw her into the circle and he begins shooting at her with a pistol, Callie avoiding the gunshots and defending herself with her knife. She tries her best to keep dodging, but it continues to get harder as the swirl of voices and faces begin to disorient her. Kane yells at her to die like she should have 2 years ago, and he threatens Skylar to prove a point. Skylar snaps and transforms into his beast mode at the sound of danger, accidentally rushing for Chris as Apollo gives his life to protect him. Callie manages to strike a blow on Kane's arm as Apollo's body falls to the ground, Skylar howling away as he runs down the streets and vanishes. And then he laughs, the twisted sound echoing as Claire and Alice scream at him to stop and struggle to free themselves, only to be held back even harder by more people. Kane talks to Callie in an inferior manner, telling her she chose to disobey him and now people are dying because of her. Callie continues to dodge as one bullet strikes her calf, letting out a yowl as she falls to her knees. Kane grins as he moves toward Callie, manipulating her into his plan as Claire breaks free behind him, Alice screaming at her to stop. Callie's knife darkens and we see her flame has turned from the green we know to a dark, vibrant black as Kane walks forward with a knife of his own. He tells her this is what happens when he breaks the rules, and she swings for his stomach, trying to keep him away from him as he pulls in the nearest person and pushes them in front of him. The person, in fact, was Claire, and without a moment between, the knife goes straight across her throat in a fiery flame of wonder. Callie, still scared for her life, tries to find a way out until she sees what has happened and stares in shock. Kane laughs wickedly as her tears begin to fall faster and faster, the North quickly breaking free at the sight and rushing over to her. The crowd cheers at the death of who they believe is a North Star member, and Alice lets out an unholy anguish as she kills the Allies holding her in place. Kane looks down to see the person who died was his sister, and he stares widely at the ground below him, realizing what he's just done as the Moons crowd around her and hold her as she dies. Weeks go by and the North are locked up inside Fern's casino, Fern and James taking turns scouring the streets for Skylar. Chris detaches himself from the gang as he buries the body of Apollo and cries every night at the loss, and Callie remains deathly quiet, barely uttering a word as she stays locked in her room with barely anything to eat for days. Her outfit had been reduced to a simple trench coat and her hands remain bloody and scarred from the guilt of the fight, and Fern tries his best to keep her safe from herself. The Moons meanwhile mourn the loss of Claire as she's buried nearby her mother, Kane disappearing for days on end as he orders them to find the North, sending out a citywide hunt for their heads. The Moons themselves begin to unravel as O starts to lose even more of his composure, guilt clawing at him over all these losses. Alice runs away at some point and no one knows where to find her, and Vivi and Manic try to hold each other together. Unfortunately, I was not able to finish this section like the others due to time constraints, and had to change up this part to get this out to all of you. But a quick summary is still on the menu, so let us finish this story rundown at a slightly faster pace. The next part revolves around the aftermath of the North versus the Moons, which led to the deaths of Claire and Apollo. Skylar is found after some time, and Kane orders Manic to investigate the local casinos for the rumors of the North's hiding spot. As he explores and vanishes while on reconnaissance, the remains of the North stumble into the bunker, finding it smaller and messier than anticipated. Eventually, they figure out Alexa's been using it as a hideout while mourning Ike, as well as her plans to take over the casino and make O suffer. They rush to the casino and find Alexa, now codenamed Scarlet, and her brother Mike controlling Manic to kill O against his will. They get into a fight and Scarlet manages to inject Fern with the drugs they've been selling, leading to Zafar taking control of the body and trying to attack Callie. His weapon grazes her cheek and Fern takes back control to punch Alexa in the face, leaving a massive burn mark as her brother is shot and everyone escapes. Manic dies to O's shooting him and his body lays next to Mike as Alexa grieves. Callie continues to spiral as she deals with the grief and guilt for the fight, leading her into Carter. Carter takes Callie to the in-between using the Hemlocks drug from earlier, and she meets the trio of Ike, Apollo, and Claire. Callie learns how they've grown and started to heal from their lives through helping each other, and she begins to heal as well. Claire pleads Callie to find Kane and stop this cycle, and Ike warns her to watch her back for Alexa as she returns back to the regular world. Alexa and O take the Hemlocks drug out of grief and find themselves in Mike and Manic's limbos, influencing them to finally take the action and choose their own paths. Callie begins to patch their group back together and stand against Kane one last time as Alexa, Alice, and Vivi join forces to end Kane's rule. Roy and Eden offer their assistance as the New North is assembled. Other allies collect themselves together and the plans begin forming. The New North cut Kane off from his resources piece by piece, and he finds his allies starting to question his reliability. The Moons have left him, and eventually the North corner him and the others throughout the area, ending in a massive battle across the city. Kane and Callie find themselves locked in a battle away from the others as they chase each other through the streets, ending in a bloody one-on-one fight. Callie eventually gains the upper hand and prepares to kill him once and for all with a gunshot, but decides against it and collapses next to him. The two share a moment of hatred and genuine reflection before Callie passes out and Alexa walks over, killing Kane and taking his clothes before the cops arrive. Fern arrives to get Callie and the group out as Alexa claims herself the new leader of the Moons to the Allies, the fight breaking up as the North's old base is burned down to the ground. A few weeks go by and we're introduced back into James' shop with Fern hanging out with him. They walk to a train station. We learn Skylar, Callie, and Alice are going to live in the countryside to finally rest after their years in the city. Chris departs to find his old neighborhood, and we see Carter and Roy continue on with their lives, remembering the events of the past few months. We find Vivi and Alexa continuing in the Moons, now named the Scarlet Stars, and then watch O getting thrown into jail for his many crimes. We catch up with the dead trio to see them hanging out together, watching Kane sit alone in his own limbo as Mike and Manic watch over their respective friends and family still alive. And finally, we come to a close on this insane story. If I told you that this is the first complete draft of the Hemlock story in over 2 years, would you believe me? I wouldn't, but yet this little part took so much time and effort to develop, and I'm honestly just happy it's finally here. Many more details and plot lines weren't included and will be expanded upon in the future, but for now, this is the gist of the wonderful story. So, now that you know the storyline of Hemlocks, it's time I personally introduced you to each of the characters and the writers behind them. In each of the following sections, I will talk about the backstory of each character in question, showing past versions, iterations, and depictions of them as they've changed and grown. And for a little surprise, some of the sections have been voiced by some of the others on the team, which I think you're going to enjoy. So, let's get started with the cast of the Red Moons. First up, we have the leader of the Red Moons himself, Kane Hamilton, created by Cage the cartoonist and written by us. Born the eldest child in 1878 and raised into a family business, Kane was trained from a young age to be the next leader of the infamous Red Moons, one of the main overlords in New York's underground market of drugs, weapons, intel, and talent. His parents, Marisa and Nicholas Hamilton, were the third generation of leaders before him, taking the names of Moonblazer and Insight and running a clothing shop as a front for their many illegal deals on trades. Despite a solid reputation in the ranks and very few errors through his years of training, Kane was the first Hamilton to be born without a single power or ability in nearly 4 generations. This was only worsened by the fact when the next Hamilton who survived, Claire, grew up to have an aura of positivity, leaving Kane to be shunned by his father as he continued into his 20s. As time went on, their father would become more violent as the gang began to lose its dominance, leaving both Hamilton children with burning scars and their mother dead from his own gunshot. This would reach its breaking point in 1908 when the siblings banded together to stand up to him, leading their father suddenly dying in a car crash. Kane would assume leadership over the gang shortly after, with Claire as second in command, but things were different this time around. After all those years of being looked down upon for his lack of power, he knew he needed to gain the control he couldn't have, and began expanding to other sections of the market, his skills in planning and vast amounts of wealth allowing him to slowly rebuild the Moons back to where they were before. As the 1910s raged on, he began to look for a team to help carry out his goals, individuals that were powerful, talented, and bigger than life, the kind he needed to gain the upper hand on his rival, who were always a few steps behind him. The way he saw it, the more powerful assets he had, the less everyone else did, which would prove valuable as he made more allies and arrangements with other gangs. His group assembled, he began to make strides up and above the limits of what he thought he could achieve, putting the Moons back on the map and feared among the streets. Eventually though, problems began to arise within the group, and one lady in particular, Calico Harthwell, began to mess with his goals and convince others to do the same, leading Kane to kill them in a month-long hunt for their bounties. As of now, he's hired others to fill in the gap they left, and they've helped him greatly. Now all that's left is to reach the top. Who cares who gets lost on the way up? Up next, we have Claire Hamilton, created and written by Icy Hot. Claire was the second surviving child of the Hamilton family, born a decade after her brother Kane in 1888. Continuing on the Hamilton family legacy, she developed an aura of mind-enhancing positivity, allowing her to influence others around her as she wishes, much to the delight of her family. While most of her training years were spent learning how to lead Kane as his eventual right-hand man, she would also take lessons from her mom on sewing, learning how to run the clothing shop and make outfits for the Moons as she had been. Despite being the youngest in her family and lower rank than Kane, Claire was praised by her father for having her aura, a relief for Kane's lack thereof. Other times, however, he would lash out at her for taking what should have been her brother's, dishonoring the family legacy as a powerhouse not to be trifled with. This would continue up into her late teens as she watched her father descend further and further into madness, killing their mother and leaving her with a scar around her neck from his outbursts. Eventually, she and Kane banded together to get rid of their father before he did any more damage to their lives, and he died shortly after. After Kane rose to command in 1908, Claire was made the second in command just like she had been raised to do, but it was different to how they planned it would be. She had been able to keep a good relationship with her brother once she was old enough to train with him, but that began to erode from their father. He had hammered into their minds that he was a disgrace and she was a devil, and despite her best efforts to reconcile, he had closed himself off from her and left her to pick up the pieces. Realizing she'd only been raised to follow his command and now left with nothing, she decided she would make her own future, no matter what it took. Over the next few years, Claire would make amazing strides for the gang in her own life through a motivation she never knew she had. She would expand the clothing business front in 1909, providing the gang with a larger stable income and allowing bigger deals and trades to happen in the background. The quality of clothing and livelihoods improved with this development, and Kane was very pleased with her for her work. On the side, however, she began working on building a strip club business for herself, wanting an outlet from the professional atmosphere she always got from her brother. It would rise to become successful and stable in 1912, followed a few years after by the chance to train new higher-level recruits. This, unfortunately, was not the end of her heartbreak, as her closest recruit Callie and two others began to go against Kane's order and plans. No matter how much she was torn between the gang and the thoughts that agreed with her, she was forced to watch her brother hunt them down to death, only to be followed by the outlaws of any relationship inside the gang. Her and her partner Alice were forced to hide the ongoing relationship they had from everyone, just to keep each other from suffering the same fate. Now with her love hidden and her gang strained, Claire holds on to the fact that deep down, she knows her brother would never hurt her, not after what they've been through. But as the days go by, she fears she trusts that fact a little less each time. Next up, we have Alexa Xavier, written and created by Cryptid Cub. Alexa was born in a small town somewhere in Connecticut in 1888. Her parents, Ulysses and Lavinia Xavier, ran a group of professionally trained hitmen that worked for the big leagues around the country, managing to find their way into every big organization and event they could get their hands into. Raised alongside her older brother Mike, Alexa began training at a very young age to ensure no time was wasted, and she could be crafted into a viable asset, and if needed, be the successor after them. It only got worse after her brother mysteriously vanished after arguing for months with their father, being presumed dead by everybody who knew him despite his hitman skills. She was never Alexa, only the daughter of hitmen, the latest in the line, and it wasn't until she met Ike that she realized she didn't know who she was at all. She first met him at an orphanage nearby her town, confused to see other kids playing, until she saw him in a corner, a scared little boy with sadness in his face. The two began to talk and build a connection as she visited more and more, eventually convincing her parents to adopt him, or else she'd stop listening to them. Spoiler alert, it worked. With Ike now living with the Xaviers, she continued her training as it became more advanced, taking the afternoons off with them to sit and talk about the lives they wanted, the love they desired from a family, and so much more. A decade seemed to fly by as the routine of training and talking turned to being sent off on missions to scout, kill, or set up deals. Alexa began to be away from home for days or weeks as her family forced her to do longer, more complicated tasks with her allies to ensure her efficiency. Ike began to fade from her day-to-day life as he began his own work in her absence, and in turn her own life faded as well. She started to lose the anchor that kept her a person, a human being, and desperately needed a way out if she wanted to be anything other than a Xavier. Fortunately, she found her breakaway and took it as fast as she could. Her father had previously been the rivals with the leader of the Red Moons, Nicholas Hamilton, and needed someone to infiltrate the gang and keep tabs on him. She immediately took the offer and set out to the city of New York in 1916, deciding the moment she left this would be her time to finally take her life back into her own hands, even if she had to play a few others to get there. Once arrived, she would spend the next year getting acclimated to the atmosphere in the city, finding and catching up with Ike, who she found out to be a famous info broker at the top of an empire he'd been building for years. She'd missed all of this part of his life because of her family, and she wanted nothing more than to rule over the city with him by her side, with no one able to stop them in their quest for freedom. Unfortunately, there was one problem. Nicholas Hamilton was dead, had been for years. Ike informed her the current leader was his son and daughter, Kane and Claire Hamilton, the latest in the Red Moon hierarchy, currently running one of the most powerful gangs in the state. This was bad news, given Alexa didn't have any news on the siblings, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. She found out the gang had been looking for recruits to strengthen their numbers, and willingly showed off her experienced skills to slide her way in. There she met others that, similar to her, worked for the boss man, even finding allies in Callie, Fern, and O. She became more accustomed to the life under his rule, and found she hated it just as much as she did her family. But it was a worthy sacrifice as she grew closer to his inner circle of trusted members. Then in 1918, the gang leaders split over issues involving Kane, and 3 other members were exiled and killed, including Callie and Fern. Any respect she had for the lady was lost over how easily she broke to follow her own ideals, but yet somehow Fern survived. She didn't know how, apparently the other 2 had died, but he was still kicking around just fine, albeit a little less tense when they first discovered each other, and she never said it to his face, but she was glad to have another face she could rely on, even if they were fighting to the death over the smallest things. Her relationship with Ike had only improved further as he swung by the gang quite often, and with the time ticking away, she knew it was only a matter of time before she ruled them above this pathetic man and took her life back into her own hands. Next, we have O, created and written by Boiled Kells. O was born in 1884 to an unknown family, with no name he remembers except the letter O. He was taken in by a street gang from a young age, and spent a lot of his early life growing up with them as they taught him how to steal, pickpocket, and hide among the shadows. Once he was old enough to pull his weight in the group, he started to work on a mask to hide his face like everyone else did, though his would turn out much different as time went on with his eternal smile and stripes from the eyes. In his early teens, he met a new friend outside his gang named Skylar, a young wolf boy close to his age, with a routine of meeting once a month to share stories of their lives. But after a few years of this, Sky never came back one day, and he was left alone with the one friend he had presumed dead. O would eventually depart from the group as he entered his 20s, but after a few close calls with the locals, he began to start work on redefining what it meant to be himself, for fear of being found out or worse, taken in. He would accentuate his personality and daring acts to cover up the real one underneath, and become known in the area as an urban legend of sorts with the eccentric persona he built. To avoid any danger, he'd spend the next decade moving between cities and robbing banks, never staying in one place for more than a few months or a year. As the world moved into the 1910s, a war had broken out among the European nations, coming to be known across the continent as the War to End All Wars. Despite having no identification of himself in the state, O was able to slip into the fray in 1915, heading to France and becoming a mechanic. He was tasked with fixing the damaged planes that came back from the front lines, and over time became quite good at the craft. He had found a real passion for the building and fixing of machines, but after a year the war needed more soldiers, so in 1916 he began combat training. After 6 months of training, he was sent out to the front lines to fight, and after a few close calls, he was put directly into one of the battlegrounds of the war. He was able to hold his own for a while, but without any warning, a bomb was dropped into the area, exploding and killing everyone. But him. Unbeknownst to him, he had been born with the genetic ability of immortality, and the bomb has just kickstarted his cells into overdrive. Any fatal damage done to him was fixed, and he was able to get up and escape the battlefield, but it had left permanent scarring on his torso and face that would never go away. After the incident, O was discharged and sent home back to London, reunited with his mask. But upon realizing he had no home to return to, he set off at the end of the year for America. Hoping to start a new reputation where no one knew him, he wandered across the streets for a few months and started his usual gigs. He lived on the streets and was even bolder than before, until he was brought in by Kane to join the Red Moons in 1917. While the thought of a stable life was foreign to him, he was reunited with his old friend Sky, and would go on to meet a new friend, Alexa. Though the pair had grown very far away from who they used to be, O enjoyed his reconnection with Sky, until he was once again ripped away and killed by Kane for disrespecting orders. Now, O lives day by day in the gang, finishing orders and building his machines to help his newfound life in secret. While he'd never admit it, the Moons are his family now, for however long it can last, and he holds on to the connections with Ike, Alexa, and Manic like siblings he never had. And maybe, just maybe, Sky came back from the dead once in his life. Maybe he'll do it again someday. For now, he lets his own laughter hide his face, and shows the state of New York who's really in control around here. Next up, we have Alice Gracie Silva, written and created by Alice Devil. Alice was born in 1885 in France to parents she can't remember the names of, but prefers it that way. As the daughter of a working class family, she was constantly used and abused for her labor and class, her family doing much the same as they had not wanted a kid to take care of. Much of her life up until her early teens became a routine of punishment. Work for nothing, take the beatings, sleep on the park benches where it was safe, rinse and repeat. It wasn't until 1898 that something finally changed. After watching the young girl repeat the same pattern of conditioned pain for months, she was taken in by an old couple from the next town over, hoping to save her before it was too late. While many weeks went by before she could truly trust them and their intentions, Alice slowly opened up to the elders' kind word and reassurances, letting her work alongside them as they sewed clothes together for their shop. There, she was able to make friends and live a life of safety and happiness, learning how to be herself and what it meant to find a family. As the years went on, Alice would take over running the shop as the couple grew older, needing more assistance to continue and care safely, and began taking on random jobs across the town to bring in a little extra money to keep them comfortable. In 1910, she had managed to hire 2 others to take over the shops as she worked her jobs, eventually settling down into one which made her the most money. There she worked alongside a group of other workers to keep the boss stocked with paints, ink, and paper, learning he was a well-known painter who made paintings and art that no one could else reproduce. Occasionally they were required to model for him, and more often than not he would have violent outbursts towards her and the others. She nearly left the side exclusive man to find somewhere else, but she knew how much her parents needed the money, so Alice took the stand and dealt with it as best she could. Then, in 1914, she watched the couple quietly pass away, telling her she'd been the best daughter they ever could have asked for. Alice was distraught and became numb to the outside world, not noticing the world around her and feeling a hole in her heart which she'd lost the 2 people that mattered most. After visiting their graves and sitting there for a while to cry, she came to work a little later than usual, and without warning was grabbed by her arm into a room by the boss. There was something off about him, something that scared her, and before she had any time to find a way out, he began to order her around to do things for him. She was forced to set up various candles and ink lines, cleaning up the horribly messy room before she snapped to try and demand an answer out of him for this behavior. Wielding a knife, he stabbed her without a second to process, and she fell to the ground, dying shortly after of blood loss. Realizing his mistake, he rushed to finish the rituals he tried to have Alice set up and soon after volunteer for. Unknown to Alice, the boss had been colluding with demons from the underworld, making deals with him to make his paintings even better than they could be without. At the turn of the new century, he was inspired to find a way to bring his new drawings to the animated world, but couldn't find a way to make it real by himself. Thus, he would make a deal with a high-ranking demon to use a human from his world and a demon from theirs to combine it to a living, breathing work of art he could show off as his own. But her dying was not part of the plan, so he quickly finished and performed the ritual, the ink swirling into the newly passed away corpse as it coated and covered her, sprouting horns and a tail off the body before screams of anguish were heard, and Alice breathed once more. Opening her eyes to find herself alive, wound healed and shaking, she looked around frantically for what had happened. This felt wrong. She was scared, and the boss began to demand that she listen to his every word. And as her fear drained away upon hearing his voice, she felt anger. True, genuine, and unburdened malice at him for what he had done to her, what he had put her through. In a flurry of human, ink, and screaming, she turned around and punched a hole right through him in the same place he'd stabbed her, her hand morphing into ink as sharp as a blade without a moment to think. And just like that, the last destructive tie in her life was gone, and she knew she had become something much stronger than simply a human now. Alice ransacked the place for its money, clothing, and maps, boarding a train and saying goodbye to the life she lived there, the person that had died in that studio cold and alone. Over the next few years, she jumped from place to place, adjusting to her abilities and getting used to her body that had changed that day. After finding the horns and tails she formed during the ritual, she discovered she not only had grown a few inches and hit 6 feet, but her eyes had become a stunning shade of red and her scale had paled out. The ink she harnessed doubled as the blood that flowed through her, and after further discovery she learned she could summon it into any weapon she knew the look and model of. On top of that, she could transform her hands and arms into blades or shields depending on the need. But it came at a cost. Using too much of it or losing chunks of it in battle could greatly affect her health, anywhere from a light headache to passing out with breathing problems, figuring out after a while that losing ink was equivalent to blood loss. These new abilities came in handy as she made her way over to America and into the big cities, her new mutations being a target some folks put on her back. Once settled down in New York in 1916, she began to live a life of freedom, her abilities coming in handy as she dealt into weapons markets and gambled the nights away. Her air of authority kept the cash coming in and afforded her a new apartment in this wonderful city, and it wouldn't be long before she made her way into one of the most notorious gangs located in New York, the Red Moons, in 1918. Despite finding her new boss Kane a bit of a jerk, she made sure he knew if he used her, there would be consequences. It was his sister, actually, that made the world worth living in. Despite the short time they had together in public, Claire Hamilton and Alice Silva became partners, much to the outrage of Kane. Despite his best efforts to break them up, they kept together in secret, finding mutual bonds over the pain their families had caused and trust in each other no one else could understand, until a new face joined Claire's side in her life. Calico Harthwell, she called herself, a woman of strength and patience that swept her off her feet without a chance to breathe. The pair got together after many days of laughter and warmth and made a bond of trust, keeping their gang's identities a secret to live their lives and continue on without hurting each other. It might not be perfect, but to Alice, she found happiness once again in the city of her dreams, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Up next we have Manic, created by Manic Gecko and written by us. Born in 1882 as Marshall Young, he was raised in rural Pennsylvania alongside his older sister, younger brother, and parents. Growing up, a lot of his life was simple and routine, honing his skills as a carpenter as a family business and bonding with the siblings. In 1907 he would move in as a newlywed with his wife Lily Harton a town over, where he'd raised their daughter Mary Harton. It was the simple life he aspired to live, and found happiness being close to the people in his life that mattered. However, this would change in 1917 as Marshall was called in to serve the war draft, hugging his family goodbye and promising to return home soon. After a few months of training, he was sent to fight in the fields, and managed to survive all but one battle. It was late into 1917 when he missed the mine under his feet, and before he knew it, the world had gone black. He would swim in and out of this empty void for weeks, always surfacing to find himself home with his family, having made it back. Yet, every time he tried to call their names, he found he couldn't remember them, and their blurry features would fade as his body erupted into agonizing pain, only to forget the experience and have it repeat again, and again, and again. Eventually, he woke up inside a makeshift lab, finding himself weak and his limbs hard to move. All he could remember was that his name was Marshall, and his life before the war was a hazy blur. He was soon greeted by a doctor of some sorts that he never could remember the name of, and the man explained to him that when he stepped on the mine he was irreparably damaged on his arms, lower torso, and legs, needing immediate aid to keep him from dying. Being experimental surgery, the doctor had gone slowly, trying to piece him back together using metal limbs and replacing vital pieces to keep him alive, eventually being successful in restoring him into a half-man, half-metal amalgamation. The next few weeks flew by as the doctor helped him get used to his body and enhancements, regaining feeling in his limbs as he began to understand the new capabilities they offered. Through trial and error, Marshall was able to extend his arms and legs at will up to 10 feet to reach objects far away, even contort them into different shapes and tools as he practiced. Things like screws, wrenches, and saws were all fairly easy after some time, and they gave him a feeling like he'd known the ins and outs of them before, but he couldn't understand why, letting him pick a new outfit and bidding him farewell as he found himself on the outskirts of New York. And that's when it hit him all at once. There he was, next to one of the biggest cities in the country with 30 years of his life taken away from him because of some stupid war. His family, his home, even his own anatomy. It was all too much as he laughed, laughing over himself, the situation, and how it didn't feel real. It was a dream. It must be a dream considering how he raced in the city, breaking into shops and robbing stores, knocking people over and laughing as his mind raced from every corner of his head. After days of this high, he collapsed into an alley, realizing the reality he lived and cried. It was gone. So much of him was gone and he was acting like a lunatic. It hurt. So much of his head hurt and the war wouldn't leave his head and he didn't want it to win. So he decided he wouldn't let it. He decided then that he would adapt. He would change with this new life and try his best to keep himself alive. He'd find somewhere new to call home. Try to remember what made him Marshall and play the part of this mania he felt, giving himself from then on the name Manic. Maybe if he did things just right, he'd be able to remember who he was before it all, but it started by moving forward. So he began to play the part, gathering weapons and food as he took what he needed to live, making his name known as he blended into the gangs he had to keep his tracks low and learn from their skills. His robotic enhancements became very useful to avoid the deadly run-ins he encountered, and he never stopped running till that fateful day in 1918. It was by chance, really, out on one of his street runs avoiding the cops when he was saved by a man in a mask accompanied by a woman with purple hair. There they would explain to Manic he had stolen something they were hunting for, something they needed to bring back to their boss, and they weren't taking no for an answer. Guns to his head, he looked at the man and was surprised to see a face underneath that mask, eyes filled with a cool but almost sad stare. With only as much as a laugh, he tossed around the trinket, saying he'd give them such a simple thing if they could meet the boss they talked so highly of. And so they set off, finding themselves weeks later under the guise of the Red Moons together and a few budding friendships to hold on to. Beat always being on the run at least as he met the crew and trained to prepare for the future missions. Here, he felt a little more sane, a little more Marshall. And as the months went on, the bonds grew, he was happy to realize that was all he needed. And lastly, we have Vivian, created originally by Voices of the Lunatic and now written by us. While not much has been set in stone about her, she was born in 1894 and raised in London, finding herself at 14 inside a facility that used her to artificially make abilities. She'd been born with an extra set of arms and took on the appearance of a humanoid spider, and given the ability to shape webs into objects and create a toxic sludge that protected her from attacks from the injects. While considered quite weak in strength, she excelled in speed and avoiding detection, allowing her to break free and find her way into New York, joining the Red Moons in 1919. As you can tell, this section is pretty short, and believe me when I say that's an anomaly. This used to be much longer in the earlier stages of writing, but the original creator left the group soon after the section was complete. A lot of the art you'll see about her was made before they left, so we've only recently begun the process of redesigning. When her backstory is developed, however, you'll be sure to hear about it. Now that we've finished the Red Moon's lineup, time to move on to the second gang in the Hemlocks, the North Star. First up, we have Calico Harthwell, written and created by me, Minz the Mailbox. Callie was born in New York in 1887 to Jack and Mary Harthwell. Jack was a black and white tuxedo and Mary, much like Callie, was a calico, naming her daughter after her grandmother, Calico Jones. The couple wanted to raise a child away from the factories that had plagued their childhood, so they began running a bakery business together. Callie lived with her family until her early teens, becoming quite the skilled baker. She began to work alongside them in the business. Once her fire abilities had revealed themselves and developed, she took lessons from her dad on how to train and use them if needed, as he himself also shared this power. While not sheltered from the conditions they lived in, she always had her family to back her up, and she didn't realize just how bad it was until 1903. She was 16 at the time, heading to the bakery to deliver a shipment her parents needed help with. She had just arrived at the front door to the shop before time seemed to slow down. Before she even understood what was happening, a massive explosion had gone off in front of her eyes, sending her flying onto the street unconscious. A group of neighborhood and customer doctors who were regulars at the business began to treat her and anyone else that had survived the explosion, though as she would find out once awake, her parents were not part of that group. It was discovered through the town's police that the attack was a planned bombing to, as quoted, remove the beasts living in our city and get them out. And Callie would learn as time went on the bomber had meant her and her family. She had survived by pure chance that day, and for fear of another she was quickly relocated to some family friends through a city a few hours away. From then on she worked alongside the other teens in the steel factories, pushing away the new insults and bullying she received to make whatever little money she could. Her caretakers had an extra mouth to feed now, and they needed every cent she could earn. As the years rolled on into 1910s, Callie had been lucky enough to avoid any injuries at the factory apart from the occasional burn, but the constant bashing of her identity was starting to become too much to handle. They either wanted to use her abilities to get off work or insult her like trash, and they never seemed to leave her alone. Eventually, she realized no one would come to help her and started standing up to them out of sheer annoyance, getting into fights to protect what little of herself she had left. After a few months of this, she was kicked out by her caretakers onto the streets, and was left trying to find a way to stay alive. With barely any hope of living through tomorrow, she began to manage everything day by day, scrounging for food and stealing what she could to keep herself together for just another day. On one occasion, she stole a large shipment of drugs thinking it was a crate of food for a business, and before long was able to haggle a poor passerby into thinking they were hers and to pay for it. She began to watch others and learn how to buy and sell as a drug dealer, and before long she realized people didn't have much to argue when she whipped out a foot-long yellow flame from her hands. Rumors would spread around the city, and the only name people knew Callie by became Quiet Ember, and that's just the way she liked it. It all changed in mid-1916 when she was approached by a rich-looking man named Kane, who offered her a place in his gang in exchange for a better pay than she ever had. This hooked onto her immediately, and she accepted the offer, being taken in by his younger sister Claire to train and learn the ways of the Red Moons. The team would grow as the next few years went on, and finally, after all that time of being overlooked, she was in the most powerful position to burn them all down. She took pride in watching their gangs fall, setting the buildings ablaze and knocking the arrogance out of their uptight expressions. She reveled in the ability to know she could protect this gang, her new family, protect Claire and do everything they used to tell her she couldn't. But it couldn't last forever. In 1918, she overheard various deals Kane would make with the other third parties and gangs, ones that began to threaten the safety of the people she cared so much about. As much as she tried to calm her fears through venting her frustrations to the rest of the gang, she realized his rose-tinted glasses held on to their lives, so she had to take them off herself. She would go on to say her goodbyes to a very confused Claire, an attempt to publicly end a deal in front of both parties to expose Kane's lack of caring to his own gang. Through the help of Skylar and Fern, she made it out alive, but not before the decree to kill Calico Harthwell, the Quiet Ember, was sent out across the city. The trio had to fake their deaths to make sure the bounty lay off their heads, but not before the mark of the moons was branded on their shoulders and they were thrown out of the last gang they ever had. But Callie wouldn't give up. Not after they killed her parents, not after they used her in the factories, not after they threw her out, and especially not after he took away her family. So she began to plan, the trio working together to figure a way back up. Callie would form the new gang of the North Star, a resistance built to topple the top gangs in power and make way for new blood to shine through. She would become known as Nightwalker, and trained her own abilities to produce and fight a green flame to hide any connection to her former self. They would specialize in the drug industry, working with dealers to form a new, more powerful drug using who knows what. And as 1920 rolled around, the gang had toppled many already. She knew anger led her to be blind, so she harnessed it within herself, reaching out a kind but firm hand for others to hold. She would empower the ones left behind in the quest for power, finding love in the most unusual of people, and she would show them all what it meant to be a Harthwell in the streets of New York. And then maybe, just maybe, she'd live to see the day where she finally won the battle.
Next up, we have another member of the North Star, and one of the former members of the Red Moons, Skylar McCarthy, otherwise known as the Beast of the North, also known as my boy, my baby, my pride and joy. Now, you must be wondering, where did this British person come from? Where's my funny American cat go? Well, bozos, you're getting me for this segment because I was the one behind this guy's creation, development, and just, well, everything. So hi, I'm Static, and this is Skylar's story. Skylar was born in 1881 London as an only child into a very poor family. His parents were unable to find stable jobs due to their status in the world, and it was often difficult to provide basic food and clothing for the family. His parents loved him dearly, yet the fact that they were struggling to afford necessities for their son was obvious. At one point, Skylar came across a small and frail-looking boy who seemed to call himself O. At first, Skylar was wary of the strange-looking boy, who wore a mask constantly and never seemed to take it off. Yet, as they bumped into each other more and more, they became rather friendly, getting to know each other and meeting up regularly to talk and just be kids. Skylar was pretty happy with this, until the year 1897. A few months after his 16th birthday, Skylar noticed an advertisement on a telephone pole, claiming they needed test subjects of 16 and over to partake in a series of vaccines that were being developed. Skylar was uninterested at first, until he noticed the amount of money that was being given to said test subjects. He almost immediately signed up, not even asking his parents' permission and not even letting his only friend, know. He left with a simple note to his parents, saying he was going out for the day and would be back by the afternoon. He turned up to the clinic expecting to go through a few trials and then be sent back home, which was very much not what happened. He ended up being told he had to go to a larger facility so they could monitor his status during the testing process, and he agreed. He was then injected upon entering to the facility and was promptly thrown into a padded cell to be monitored. As the injection took effect, he felt his muscles tearing themselves apart as he began to grow and grow and grow until he grew to be a 15-foot monster that stood on 4 legs, hunched and terrifying. The injection that Skylar had been given was an artificial power harvested from the blood of another that made Skylar able to turn into a horrifying beast depending on his stress levels and emotions. They would keep him in this testing facility for several years, aggravating him, torturing him, abusing him. As the experiments continued, it was clear that Skylar showed several side effects when showing this power. One of said side effects is that he is unable to recall much of the events that happened both before and during his transformations, and so the constant abuse of his power in the laboratory ended up giving him long-term memory issues, and a lot of his childhood was forgotten, never to be uncovered from the depths of his mind. He would stay in this facility for years upon years before he set foot out into the world again. Several years of constant poking, prodding, and aggravation had driven Skylar to near insanity, his life bound to the laboratory that he had been tested on and kept captive in for the past 14 years, and it all came crashing down when he escaped from the laboratory one day, killing a lot of the staff in the hazed frenzy of his beast form. Once he escaped, he fled to the one place his mind could remember: home. When he turned up, his parents hardly recognized him at first. The experiments in time he was kept there changed his body from a small, frail 16-year-old to a monstrous 7-foot-tall beast. His parents did recognize him, eventually, and welcomed him with open arms, only for Skylar to claim that he couldn't stay with them any longer. He only came back to say goodbye before he fled the country. He ended up boarding a boat with funds given to him by his family, just enough to get to his destination, America. His trip was successful, and he travelled around America for a few years, if only to get used to how everything worked before he settled down in the big city of New York in 1914. Up to this point, he'd had to get by stealing and learning to survive on the streets of America, and would use his skills he learned along the way to be able to survive in New York. He would become a lot more violent as the year went on, as New York was a dangerous place to be. He'd often not need to get into a fight due to his large exterior, but when they did, he'd often have to rely on his brute strength to win fights. That is, until someone peculiar showed up. A gang member by the name of Claire. She would come across Skylar due to the fact that Skylar had been seemingly fighting and intimidating the wrong people, and Claire had come to teach this dog a lesson. It was apparent that Claire was skilled at what she did, and would soon overpower him, as brute strength alone would never have won this fight. Yet, instead of finishing him off or continuing the assault, she got off him, extended a hand to him, and gave him an offer. Join the gang she was working for and be provided with food, a place to sleep and security, or be left to die in the street. Skylar pondered for a while, before taking a hand in his and being led to a new life.
Next up is Fern, originally created by Volganime HD and written by Cryptid Cub. Fern was a tiefling-esque bartender, born in 1887, raised in South Carolina alongside his younger sister while helping out his parents' business. They had a small family shop, usually selling antiques and the sort, though his family lacked funds to survive off this. Thus, he also worked part-time at the local casino as dealers and waiters. Though Fern and his sister didn't work at the casino with their parents, they learned how to deal cards and play poker on the off chance their parents weren't working. A few years later, when Fern had just turned 18, his mother fell ill with a deadly sickness, eventually dying 2 years later. In her will, she left money for Fern and his sister, hoping they would leave their small town for a big city and make better livings there. Though distraught, he left for New York City and to hope to fulfill his mother's wishes, leaving his sister and father behind. Once he arrived, he quickly found work as a bartender at a small family-owned casino. Though Fern started with humble beginnings, he quickly rose to become an expert bartender and dealer. Most of all, though, a savvy businessman. Around the age of 26, he started his own independent bar, with the hopes of becoming a staple casino in New York. Over the years, he made many strange deals and contracts that all turned in his favor, only helping to solidify his place. Eventually, he achieved his dream, having built a renowned casino called the Caped Killers at only 29. Around the age of 30, he turned down a deal from a local mafia group, asking for him to be an info carrier of sorts for their missions. Later that night, a hitman from this group had attacked Fern, leaving him to bleed out in an alley. On the verge of passing out, a demonic pigger had approached him in the shadows, remarking on the deals he'd made and turned down in the past, and asked him to make a deal in exchange for another chance at life. Fern, with no other option, accepted, not yet understanding the precautions of this. As he awakened, fully healed through the demon's power, it emerged, with Fern now able to see him. He introduced himself as Zafar, an ancient entity cursed to live as a shadow with a fraction of his power. Until now. The deal that Fern had made would grant multiple lives when nearing death, but at the cost of his body. Every time it died, he'd re-emerge with a part of himself taken over by Zafar, limbs changing to match his form. In their first meeting, his arm had turned red, with thick claws, a strange black marking along his eyes having black scara. In the years following, he found out the identity of the hitman who had killed him as a woman called Alexa. Despite having just seen the corpse of a man she killed still talking, she seemed intrigued by this, and asked if he would rethink the deal with the Mafia group, who turned out to be the Red Moons. Though declining multiple times, he eventually gave in, but only under the condition that it didn't interfere with his business. Once in the Red Moons, he quickly saw the issues with their system and joined sides with the soon-to-be North Stars. When this group of defiant members finally stood up for themselves, Fern had Yost led another life, and in the process grew a second pair of horns, along with the ability to use fire from his cursed hand. He later found out he was able to do it since he'd been cursed, but Zafar refused to tell him until he was in danger. After having split from the Moons and joining the North Stars, he works from his casino and uses it as a meeting spot for passing and giving information to and from the North Stars. Though Zafar seems resistant to the Norths, Fern tries his best to lead his life, despite the situation he found himself in. Next up, we have James Davis, written and created by Kiro. James was born in 1885 to Charles and Margaret Davis in Albany, New York. There he lived at home for the most part with his mother, his father going out every day to work on the railroads that needed maintenance. Much of his early life was peaceful as he played around with the neighborhood kids, helping his father rest when he came home each day after long hours of working. After a few years, their need for money increased, and Margaret went to work with his father, but as for the family as a whole, this began a dark spiral into anger. James was 15 when he was taught how to sew by his mother to help him make his own clothes while she was away, and 18 when she gave him a very nice suit to keep as he grew up. She made him promise he would show her what it looked like when it fit him, but despite his best efforts, she wouldn't live to see the day. With the two of them working together on the rails, Charles became increasingly angry, and outbursts of violence against her became more and more common. James tried to stop it where he could to help her, but it always almost ended him getting hurt too. Bruises and scars began appearing in 1904 as he tried to get him and his mother out on many occasions, but it was no use. It would all change on the fateful day that Charles shot her straight through the heart and chased him across the town, the screaming searing into his mind as he dodged the bullets and punches thrown at him. Through sheer luck, James managed to outrun his father and avoid the same fate as his mom. But as for his own safety and to protect the gift she made him all those years ago, he had to say goodbye to his town, boarding a train and hoping the other end was better than this. And with whatever luck he had, it was. He would arrive a week or so after in New York City and begin odd jobs around to make money, finding a liking to fixing vehicles as the needs for more repairmen rose. After a while of doing repairs on foot, James would officially open his automotive repair shop in 1908 and began hiring more mechanics as time went on. Through their efforts, business became more steady, and he'd spend many hours fixing cars and hanging out with his crew, finding friends in them all. The only hiccup, however, was some of the customers were a bit more infamous than he thought they'd be. As he found out, gangs also used vehicles, go figure, and his shops happened to be a useful place to set up deals and get things fixed. Once he realized they didn't intend to hurt him and began paying more to keep his employees quiet, he was more than happy to oblige, and the crew began to get used to the different masks and auras of the usuals. In 1918, however, one of the crew was a bit unique. James was requested personally by a lady named Nightwalker, and instead of wanting just his services, she wanted to hire him. A little extra pay to be a getaway driver wasn't too bad of an offer. He even got his own place in the ranks. He always returned every few days to tell his crew about the adventures and became a little warmer with the rising gang of the North Stars. They were a confused little bunch, but hey, he was happy to be a part of it. Next up, we have Christopher Miguel Sanchez, written and created by Gamer. Chris was born in 1892 during the Cuban War for Independence. Growing up, he lived with his mom and dad on the family farm, and became quite skilled at helping with the upkeep. In 1902, however, independence was successful for the brand new republic, and with it came the worry of safety in the Sanchez household. To keep themselves safe, they left their home and began a long journey across the US until eventually ending up in New York. There, they settled down in a neighborhood of various South American immigrants and began a new life. To keep the family afloat in their new home, his father began to work in the automotive factories for minimal pay, trying his best to scrounge up any last penny he could from the long hours. Eventually, though, Chris would join in with his dad to help with the costs at 12, but no one seemed to really care about his young age. He went on to make some friends along the conveyor lines while the older folks worked down in the boiler rooms. For the most part, nobody got hurt, minus the occasional cut or lost finger, until one day when the factory boilers exploded. It was 1905. To Chris, it was like any other tiring day of work, but without even a second to understand what was happening, a massive explosion ricocheted through the entire building. Machines malfunctioned, the building shook, and people were running all around screaming as he was forced onto the conveyor belt from a piece of falling debris. He wavered in and out of consciousness for a bit until he felt a horrible pain in his fingers, and it was far too late to save them when he looked over and watched as his arm got crushed into the machinery. He started screaming as it continued up his arm until he finally managed to rip away his elbow, narrowly save everything above, passing out from the blood loss and trauma. Eventually, a team of medics were rushed in and helped whatever survivors out they could, but as Chris would later learn, his father had died from the poisonous gases that erupted from the boiler room, and died shortly after. After using the last of their savings to get his arm fixed up and saved, his mother would pass away a year later from pneumonia, leaving Chris to bury his parents together in the cemetery. After that, he was taken in by his neighborhood as they bounced around his care and needs between each other for a few years, but as the price of rents rose higher in 1910, Chris left to realize he had to leave his home to stay alive, and so he said goodbye. Living on the streets in New York City with no way of earning pay, he turned to crime. He started out with small petty thefts, stealing food and clothes to keep himself alive. Once he had mastered the skills, however, he began to steal jewelry, wallets, and bills, managing to work his way up to affording an apartment. Eventually, he was noticed by a gang in the area in 1912, and they offered him a spot if he swore loyalty. He happily agreed to the new position, and they began teaching him how to fight and defend with his arms and legs. He was welcomed improperly into the gang after a few months of training and errand running, and as a signature of the ranks was given a barbed baseball bat. His life was now fully involved in the crime sphere and began doing drug deals, assassinations, and robberies. He became so good, in fact, that he was able to steal some of the drugs they were transporting, and has then went on to become heavily addicted to them. Together they were a force to be reckoned with, but as 1917 rolled around, he was caught in the act of drug stealing and was forcibly kicked back on the streets, left with only his apartment and the money he had left. With nothing left to keep him alive, Chris continued stealing anything he could to pay for his addiction, living off the bare minimum as the drugs continued to wear away at him and his sanity. Eventually, he would stumble across what looked like an abandoned warehouse, and upon entering to see what he could steal, was caught empty-handed by a lady pointing a gun at him. This would be his first meeting with Nightwalker, and as he pleaded for his life and promised her he wasn't in any gangs, she took him into her gang to clean him up. Proper pay, clothing, and a warm warehouse room to settle into was more than enough as he performed many menial jobs for the gang to prove himself and his abilities. He began to bond with the second-in-command he came to know as Skylar, and the medic Apollo was one step ahead of him, but in 1919, after nearly a year of doing this, he wanted to show his worth to everyone. After following the gang in and helping them complete a new mission, he was both scolded and praised for his efforts, if a bit rash. The leader, now learning her name was Callie, appointed him ready to join the ranks of the North, and now with the budding bonds of those around him, the future began to look a little brighter. Now that we've finished the North, it's time to welcome in the allies of Hemlocks. First off, we have Ike Petrov, written and created by Ike. Ike Petrov was born Amelia Petrova in Russia 1886, born to a young mother she can barely remember and a father she never met. Her first few years of life were a blur, learning much later her mother had been raised into the trafficking industry and had barely kept herself and her child alive in it. Shortly after Amelia had turned 5, she was taken away from mother by a man who took them across the seas to America, where she'd be forced into the same role her mom had been for years. Most of these years had become blocked from her mind to keep herself safe, and surviving one day to the next was a challenge she was scared she wouldn't win soon. But one fateful day in 1896, a maid working in the house took her and rushed her out, giving money and a name to go find to keep her safe. She had to change, she needed to escape, and this was the opportunity she needed. They would follow the name and have a special kind of procedure performed on them to change who they were, the poor conditions making it a risk. But despite the setbacks, he managed to survive the ordeal, now a young boy finally able to escape the life that had cornered him for so long. Ike would end up in an orphanage not too long after, scared to open up to anyone after everything that happened until one day she arrived. A young girl he couldn't understand, shrouded in an air he couldn't perceive, but the first person he'd met since the maid that felt different. They would grow closer each time she visited until the day he was properly adopted into the Xavier family, an act he would hold on to for the rest of his life. There he shared nearly every day with Alexa, training with her parents in the art of reconnaissance and spending the afternoons next to her side as they laughed on top of the world. The good times flew by so fast for the pair, and as she began to train in more advanced classes, he considered telling her about his feelings, the ones that swelled every time he got to see her, but out of fear of losing her he held them in, and watched as she became more distant the more time went on. She was sent out on missions for days or even weeks and found himself alone for more often than not, a pang of hurt every time she would forget to say goodbye or wasn't there for him. Eventually he decided that if she was busy, he would be too, and began taking missions from their parents to ignore the bitterness that had begun to wear away at him. One would land him in New York in 1909 to facilitate a deal between two parties. He tried his best to watch it from afar, but by complete accident he interrupted it, and managed to turn the deal's favor toward the rightful owner. It was after this interaction he got his first contact, the first number outside the Xavier line, so out of curiosity he decided to stick around. He would go on to set up contacts with many more people as the months went on, helping to reveal a criminal to the police and acting as a front for the downfall of a larger gang in the area. He'd rented out an apartment behind the bar from a lady named Eden to work out of as he steadily collected more and more notes, contacts, pictures, cameras, you name it. He slowly bonded with the bartender as she covered more from him on multiple accounts, and the months began to turn into years. Ike realized how much he enjoyed this power, how nice it felt to have this level of control over the lives of so many people, even if a bit overblown to hide the true nature of his gatherings. All he had to do was watch things fall and take their money. It was so easy, and his reputation only grew as more events transpired. Alexa would never truly leave his mind, but the empire he had built was a good way to push it away, to let out the frustration and anger he had onto the people in the way of his paycheck and live to see another day. He had practically perfected the art of reconnaissance in his own mind, ignoring the occasional slip-ups and creating elaborate hoaxes and rumors to confuse anyone who tried to find him. It didn't matter if he felt unsatisfied, because all it took was a quick outing and a cigar to drown out any worries he had. It all changed, however, when Alexa showed up in New York in 1916. All that frustration, all the dreaming, all his work and efforts crumbled down to have another moment with her. The pair began catching up with their lives after falling out, and Ike saw how much she yearned for the freedom away from her family. It was at that moment Ike understood he wanted nothing more than to get the both of them out and leave behind this sick world forever, but that would take time. So he began planning, working, and putting in more effort than he ever had been. He never showed it, but he was always worried for his safety in the city, knowing how dangerous it could be without the knowledge of this place. He'd spend the next few years following the moons and helping them out when they needed it, then inserting himself into the North Star's ranks to serve his own needs. Nothing against the lady running it, but the information he got in return for helping her was too valuable to pass up, too good an opportunity to bring himself one step closer. And now, after so many years of remaining untouchable, he'd achieved everything he wanted to get them out of this terrible city and get them both somewhere safe to live the lives he wanted for them.
Next we have Apollo Smith, written and created by Twice-Faced, which is yours truly. Born in 1875, his parents were blacksmiths, working during the height of the American Civil War, and sometime after he was 10, his parents had had his little sister. Life was content for the time as he took over the role of a pseudo-parent for her, wanting to make sure she had someone in her life she could rely on. The pair was used to the neglect from their parents as they spent every moment they could working to make ends meet, often forgetting they had children at all. That was until his parents were caught for armed robbery, and whether it was the severity of the crime or the bias for being lower-class citizens, no one knew, and they were sentenced to life in prison, leaving a 12-year-old Apollo and his 2-year-old sister to fend for themselves. The two were sent to an orphanage together, and from there on out, Apollo made sure to protect her at all costs. They would stay there as the pair grew up, enduring the harsh conditions they were subjected to and trying to stay on the good side of the managers. Apollo tried his best to clean any wounds she and other kids endured through their work, finding a peace in it and hoping it would make him favorable to anyone wanting to adopt. In 1903, they broke out and were taken in by a gang that commonly roamed the streets, and Apollo was able to wiggle his way into the local school to take classes. There he would go on to enter the study of medicine after a few years of education, going back to the gang each day to teach his sister everything he knew while she worked. Disaster would strike in 1913 as Apollo prepared to enter the military's medical field. The gang would go out to celebrate his success a few nights before he was set to leave, where they were ambushed, leaving only a few survivors left and his sister dying as well. He would go on through training and into the field, grieving her, becoming cold to others around him and vowing not to let another life be lost like hers had been. He would spend the next few years doing this in 1918, becoming known among the ranks as one of the best medics around. Only few dared to get close to the man for fear of the attitude he brewed, making only a few friendships during his years before having to leave on injury. He returned to New York with a prosthetic leg after having it maimed while retrieving an injured soldier. Once back in the States, he'd spend a few months in the military station to recover back into society, and found a job working for a big hospital in the area. There, he once again built up a reputation for his skills in treating injuries, and found a small group of fellow medics that didn't mind his harsh tongue. He would spend 2 years there finding good pay and a stable home for himself, until the day his patient turned out to be a leader of the rebellious North Stars. He landed himself a job with her once she recovered, finding himself an ally to the gang and slowly bonding with the youngest Chris. Present day, he is better known as the Plague Doctor, his medical knowledge almost unmatched in the criminal underworld. There, he takes care to make sure this gang lasts as long as it can, rushing through the streets to protect the people he cares about no matter what.
And last but not least, we have the newest allies to be added into the story. Roy Tidwell, Michael Xavier, and Carter Collins, written and created by Buddy Putty, Mike, and Kiwi Tsushi, the newest members in the Hemlocks team. We don't have a whole lot of them just yet, but I can relate to you what I know. So let's wrap up this character deep dive with a triple meal special. First up, we have Roy Tidwell, written and created by Buddy Putty. Roy is a well-known PI known for his skill in finding and exposing secrets in the underworld of New York. While not much of him is known before he's involved in the story, he was born in 1880 and hired by Kane in the beginning to investigate the North to find out their secrets and weaknesses. For good pay, of course. We get to see Roy as a very neutral character throughout the story, not for any particular cause or association, just wanting to get paid and not minding how it happens. Second, we have Mike Xavier, written and created by Mike. He was the firstborn of the Xavier family in 1879, followed by Alexa a few years later. During his life, he was raised to be the next in a powerful line of hitmen to support and run the family business. Unfortunately, in his teens, he disagreed with how his father acted and ran things, and after a year or so, he was sent out to die. Luckily for him, he survived, but to ensure his own safety, he left for the nearby state of New York. Mike would go on to pursue a new career in mechanics and building weapons for anyone who would buy, leading to Alexa rediscovering him during the story.
Hello everyone, for those who don't know me, my name is Kiwi Sushi. Or just Kiri is fine. Now, you may be wondering, where's your local cat girl? Well, sorry to say, but you get the budget Australian cat girl now. No more sweet voice for you. Rest in peace. I am here and queer, and today we'll be voiceovering a few parts for the Hemlocks video for the lovely Lady Mittens. Let's do this. And lastly we have Carter Collins, written and created by yours truly, the Australian off-brand. Carter was born in 1891 to a family of psychics. Although peaceful for the first few years of his life, tragedy struck the Collins family soon after Carter had turned 5. One mugging went wrong and Carter's father, Arthur Collins, was killed. Luckily, Carter was spared when a nearby officer had heard the commotion, unfortunately being too late for his father to be saved. He developed a closer bond with his mother after this and would frequently help her around the fortune shop, sorting out herbs and the sorts, although he was adamant to indulge himself in the psychic side of things, but he was expected to carry on the tradition from the moment he was born. While the ability to see ghosts around the living and making contact with their realm was very fascinating to him, he'd always yearned for something more, something that could give him a purpose. So, after reaching adulthood, he set off to go find something that spoke to him. He had eventually settled on becoming a detective, though without the support of his mother and the constant disbelief in his skills from the team. When the time came around for him to complete his first field mission with the senior officer, well, let's just say he should have practiced differentiating between the dead and the living a bit more. With blood-soaked paws and the words of the only person who had ever believed in him ingrained in his head, he ended up in New York after some time. Carter would eventually settle in a small lot and try to focus on becoming a journalist. During his many journeys, he was determined to hunt down the stories no one else had ever heard of, the far and few between, to fill his strong sense of curiosity and justice. Unluckily for Carter, he would be frequently plagued with migraines and a bloody nose after many intensive sessions. And curiously, after a while of searching for a remedy for this, he eventually came across a breakthrough, in the form of a hemlock flower. Now, hemlocks were known for their psychic abilities to users, and he discovered that, just like his family once told him a long time ago, they enhanced his visionary abilities, enough to connect more than just himself to the other side. This would lead him to truly start his business, bringing in people who wanted a few moments with the people that they lost, and submitting stories to the papers based on what they had saw. It worked well to keep him alive, but eventually, he had set his eyes on a particular lady, one who was followed by multiple ghosts. And Carter thought to himself, maybe there was a deeper story here than he knew.
Thank you, Kiri. And finally, after nearly half an hour, or more, we have made it through every single character and approximately 50% of my sanity. I will also not be commenting on how long it took me to write those because it scares me to think about, so before you get dragged down to writing heck like I was, let's move on to our next section. You see, the only real way to expect the unexpected is to not expect the unexpected. You know, maybe if Kane had done that, he wouldn't have died, but that's old news by now. Anyways, we're here to talk about the gangs. You see, if you've picked up anything over the last few minutes, you would have noticed that the two gangs are a little different, shall we say. One's this big generational powerhouse that's been going for ages, and one's this very small, trying to just disrupt everything. Well, why is that? Let's talk about that. And to start it off, we're gonna go talk about the Red Moons. Why? Because I started with the Red Moons before and we're just going to keep rolling with that. Roll the clip. Starting off, we have the Red Moons in all their chaotic glory. To save ourselves the time of explaining the previous 3 generations of Hamiltons running the gang, for now, we're going to focus only on Kane's reign of the Red Moments today. With that said, let's talk about Kane for a moment, given how important he is to the gang's operations. One thing I mentioned earlier when we discussed Kane's backstory was his growing need for control. Control of his gang, control of his peers, and most importantly, control of the city. This led him to killing off the trio that started the North Star, as well as the many alliances, deals, and takeovers of other gangs he pursued. This molded the dynamic of the gang into one of strict calculations and planning, making every small detail go through him before it could be acted upon. Any planned missions, outings, and even leaving for the day all had to be run through him, to ensure his goals were being met and making changes as necessary. This was the original goal of hiring talented people from across the state, to exploit their strengths and use them so no one else could, using as many resources as the head of the family lineage to keep it all in check. As we've come to learn, however, many things slipped through the Mooner's watchful eye, many things that would eventually lead to his downfall. As the Moons accepted that Kane wanted nothing to do with them personally, and vice versa, various heists, nights out at bars together, and even the alliances with others outside the game were completely normal and commonplace. Claire ran her own business and hung out with Vivi, Alice had a partner in close bonds with Claire, Alexa was friends with the biggest info dealer in the state, as well as dueling a direct enemy of the Moons as frenemies. The trio of O, Manic, and Vivi would commonly go out to rob businesses right under the boss man's nose, and on top of all that, they made sure he saw none of it if they could help it. Kane may control the gang and what happens through it, but just like Callie saw through his controlling ways, it'd be too late before he realized he never could control the people within it. The North Star, on the other hand, is very different to the Mooners, in terms of the dynamics in the group and the core goals itself. The North was built on the foundation of taking back the control they and many others had lost to the big gangs running the city's underbelly for years, and as the leader of said group, Callie had seen her fair share of it. As we've discussed before, Callie, Sky, and Fern all used to be part of the Red Moons a few years before the story began, but after realizing the danger Kane was putting them and the gang in for his own benefits, she was able to rally the trio together with her to stand up to him, which ended in their presumed deaths and loss of almost everything they knew and loved. Thus, the North Star was born as a way to fight back from the inside and get back at those who wronged them. In terms of the gang itself, Callie took what she had learned from the Moons and used it to make a better structure. She became very hands-on and a part of the process when it came to the plans and alliances, and regularly had meetings with the members to discuss future wants and needs. Instead of a leader and their allies, she worked hard to build a group foundation with everyone, enforcing the orders she knew she had to uphold while working as a team to create efficiency and use of everyone's skills. There was always a moment to share a laugh with someone to create bonds between each other, always a time to build the relationships that mattered. The North worked hard to ensure both themselves and their goals were secretive, always planning a few steps ahead and rarely being seen without their masks and codenames. The odds may be stacked against them, but they always find a way to subvert the expectations placed on them by those above. Now, the history of the Red Moons is a long one, stretching back 4 generations of Hamiltons to the 1840s. The story starts here with Carmen Hamilton and Walter Jones, a couple working to keep themselves and their daughter, Betty Hamilton, alive. Despite their best efforts, the conditions they lived in began to get harder and harder to afford the basic necessities. Eventually, this would lead them to start delving into the city's underworld to find jobs in 1845, bringing on more and more of their neighbors and friends until they amassed a large team of people willing to work together to support everyone. This would be the beginning of the Crimson Skies in 1850, named after the moon which turned dark red every few years. They would continue to grow and support the gang they had created, leading to Betty marrying Scotch Taylor and the pair having their child, Nicholas Hamilton, in 1856. Things would continue on the same for a while, and as Nick grew up inside his grandparents' gang, his parents taught the young teen how to defend and protect himself from the dangerous world they lived in. But after a sudden shootout which left both Carmen and Walter dead in 1868, Betty and Scotch would take over as the next leader of the Skies, the family mourning the loss of the couple. They tried their best to keep everything together and hold the Skies into one uniform group, but over time things began to split off, and newer, stronger gangs were created, ones that started to rival the Skies themselves. After a decade of trying, they grew tired of the battle they were slowly losing against, and in 1882 entrusted the gang to the new couple of Nick and Marisa Hill. They gave their blessings to his firstborn, Kane Hamilton, and left the city to find somewhere to settle down to live their lives in peace. Nicholas, now 26 and the leader of the Crimson Skies, had the monumental task of piecing together the unraveling gang and bringing it back to its former power. He had learned many things over his lifetime in the Mafia, and he'd seen it rise and fall. If he wanted to avoid that same fate, he needed to be stronger than his family had been, tougher and stricter to keep them all in line, and he needed to put his name out there. He rebranded the gang as the Red Moons we know today, setting his placehold down into the underbelly of New York as the Moon Blazer, a force to be reckoned with. He began to seek perfection in everything he achieved to create the strongest gang he could, fearful of ending up like his own parents or worse, letting everything tumble down again. He pushed Cain harder and harder to learn everything there was to be him, to be a leader and raise them up like he had. But the perfection he seeked began to fall away when it was discovered his son had no powers. Carmen, his grandparent, had started the influx of power through her phytokinesis, controlling plants, and his parents, Betty and Scotch, could control earth and fire respectively, and now he too had fire along with his wife Marisa, who had foresight into the future. Cain had become the first Hamilton in recent memory to not wield a single ability, and Nick punished him for it. They tried to have more kids to strengthen the family, but 2 more died before their second child, Claire, was born. The moons had begun to slip down into a spiral as Nick tried harder and harder to find perfection in his fracturing mind, but ultimately it led to him killing his wife and his own death, leaving their 2 kids to pick up whatever was left. This takes us to now, 12 years into Cain's leadership of the gang, and then after the story, where Alexa had successfully taken power to the throne. Despite her fragile state of mind, she would hold on to whatever she could and take control much like Cain had before her, leading to the new name for the world to see, the Scarlet Stars. The Stars were chaotic and ruthless as she reigned over in the beginning, Claire left dead from the fighting and Cain free from all control as he wandered over the streets, the Hamilton legacy nearly gone in the span of a year. Whatever happens next, well, that's for another day. Hey, Vsauce. Michael here. You see, now that we've talked about the story and the gangs, what else is there to talk about? Video over. Except no, it's not. Now we get to talk about the whole world of Hemlocks. You betcha, we did a lot more than just the story and the gangs. We actually developed the world a little bit. And yeah, it might be hard to believe, but actually, there are quite a few elements that are based in reality. And plenty of elements, as you can tell, based in fantasy, so let's talk about it. As a team, we've spent countless hours designing, researching, and proofing the world that was 1920s New York. As the nature of the story changed from its infancy to present day, the want for achieving historical accuracy grew to accommodate our needs. Within reason, of course. You can actually see this shift visually if you compare the versions of each character's designs. Most of them were drawn for fun and thus were no consecutive order when or how they should be made in the beginning. As time went on, however, the story began to feel more like its own separate identity, and more care and effort was put into how each article of clothing looked, compared to many reference images. And it didn't stop with the characters. Everything from style, factories, hair dye, and even location were thoroughly researched to make sure 1, it existed by 1920, and 2, it would have been seen around those years. A few examples I've worked on myself for the story involve Callie's backstory and design. When designing her from the previous iterations, I took many notes of how the law worked, the general attire of the area, and the types of industries common among her childhood. First, in most places there was no unanimous police force. It was usually made up of volunteers and physicians who were located close by. Next, the poor working class around the beginning of the 20s wore caps, baggy pants, and suspenders, and would usually only have 1 or 2 sets to last them a few years. And finally, many industries were booming at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th centuries, including the quite common steel production lines. These factories took iron and refined it into steel en masse, allowing it to create low-skill entry points and mass needs of human labor. Some other examples of this include Chris' origins and pride for Cuban Independence Day, Cain's generational line of mob bosses running the moons, and the war drafts in World War I with O and Manic. While lots of things don't line up or are made for the story, there have been quite a few efforts to try and bring life to the 20s that have gone by. I don't think I'm surprising anybody when I say that Hemlocks is most definitely a fictional story. However, there are general rules we've established on how the world runs in tandem with our additions, so let's go over them. To start us off, we have the furries. Someone had to mention it, and there were very clearly no anthro people in the 20s. Obviously. To work with this, we designed levels of mutations in human civilization within the time period, with ranges of effects differing. On the low scale, there's no effect at all. You're a human with no abnormal qualities present, and nothing changed about your appearance. This would include people like Ike, Alexa, and Cain. As you slide towards the middle, however, things like horns, teeth, limbs, and even shape can appear or be changed. At this scale, once a person in this category hits puberty, their eyes begin to glow as a byproduct of the changing body. This would include people like O and Apollo. Then on the higher end of the scale, you get very visible and large changes to the body, structure, and appearance, most commonly in the form of some animal. This much more obviously includes people like Sky, Callie, Carter, and Roy. The scale of the effects tends to be genetic and can change over time. Example being Callie and Sky's parents very clearly also being cats and wolves, with Callie taking her pattern of fur after her parents. Fun little detail that calicos tend to only be females, so Callie took after her mom. But that's not all. Next we have the in-between, a limbo of sorts for deceased souls and demons visiting the human realm. This place is shrouded in a lot of mysteries and unknowns, but we do get to learn a bit of how it works. Whenever a soul has unfinished business or someone that binds them to the living world, they're sent to the in-between, and each person's experience within the realm is unique to them. For Ike, it's all black and white streets like the photographs he took so many of, the ones he lived his life around, but he can't see the color in himself either. For Apollo, it's back in his time as a medic for the war, the sound of planes overhead every so often, healing the patients coming in, but can't heal himself. And for Claire, it's a thick forest, tall trees with the sunlight peeking in, the forest floor covering her in flowers that she can't seem to get rid of, each a representation of what's holding them back, and the things that change when they begin to heal. And finally, we have the abilities section, and the various ways this has affected the world of Hemlocks itself. Much like mutations in shape and appearance, abilities, or more commonly known as powers, are heavily varied and are genetic through bloodlines, leaving room for quirks along the road. The abilities seen during the story involve ghost seeing, fire summoning, and an aura of positivity from the line above characters, as well as prophetic visions from Kane's mother, Marisa. Each ability affects the user differently and has various ups and downs to it, like for example the vision seeing. As she grew older and used her abilities more and more for the gang, she began to slowly lose her eyesight, leading to her pre-death attire of glasses to see. With ghost seeing, Carter is able to enhance the effects and interactions with the in-between as needed with Hemlocks, but even without can still sense and vaguely see the apparitions floating about in the world, being both a hindrance in life and useful for his job. And finally, the fire summoning. Multiple characters have been shown to be born with it, and it is a very wide range of uses as it's trained. The color of fire wielded by the users determined by their needs and types of the training they did, leading to yellow fire at close ranges but green at mid ranges. If you'd like to know the full ranges of uses for the fire wielders, here's a chart I made explaining all the different types. But that's not the end of the story. Various characters like Vivi, Alice, Skylar, and Manic are a unique category of their own, having the abilities of cybernetics, poison shielding, beast forms, and ink manipulation. These, as you may have noticed, are not regular abilities given to them through birth, but experiments within the world itself. With an obvious advantage for having abilities in the world, multiple organizations and individuals have tried to harness it, with varying levels of success. Alice was a semi-failed experiment that attempted to combine the powers of an inked demon with a human, granting her the enhancement she now has after her death was forced upon her to make said attempt happen, and the death of the guy who started it. Skylar was a test subject for an organization attempting to create abilities within him to get their hands on. While he gained several feet in height and became much stronger, this created multiple problems like memory loss, violent outbursts in the beast form, chronic pain, and a shorter lifespan. Manic was a drafted war veteran who was gravely injured in the war, before being tested on and turned into a cyborg. After escaping, he was granted the powers of faster reflexes and extendable limbs, but as we see in the story, the threat of someone taking over his cybernetics was a very real problem. And finally, Vivi was Subject Zero in the same facility as Skylar, gaining all various abilities like Poison Sludge defense mechanism and web forming. The drawback, however, was the need to eat other people to keep herself sane and continue living. All against the will of the other characters, sadly, but now a part of who they are, a part of this big, messed up world. Oh, hey. Are you expecting me to pop out of somewhere? Yeah, I kinda ran out of places to do that. I guess you could say I've lost inspiration. Which smoothly takes us on to our next section, the inspirations behind Hemlocks. Now, as you can guess, with a story like this and a team of writers as unique as us, inspiration came from pretty much anywhere. And that was one of the wonderful things about it. We were able to make all these wonderful ideas to patch up holes and fill in character arcs and make backstories kind of from just anywhere, from anything that inspired us. So you've been here long enough. Let me take you back over to the scripted section. It's much nicer. The story of Hemlocks as it is now started as you would expect it to. No plan. As a newly forming group wanting to draw some fun mafia outfits, there was no planning to create a story with events and character development. Most of it was spur of the moment, creating the big ideas of the story first. After things began to settle down and the team was mostly assembled, we started bouncing ideas off of one another and fitting it in as needed, trying to fill in the details of the story. We asked important questions like, why were the trio exiled from the moons? How does Callie take out Claire? Or how does the story even end? A lot of those questions would sit unanswered for many months, only finding the light of day more recently as we began to sort things out into a clearer vision. Ideas from the group and so many historical references played a big part in adding to it, including music. Music became such an important way for us to build the details of the story, and simply listening to a song that fit was enough to spur on a new idea, allowing us to start patching together all the hard work and effort we'd put into it. Given how long the years can be, many things have come in to inspire the group over time, myself included, and there have been a few favorites here and there. Some of my favorites project included a Hamilton animatic I watched called Room Where It Happens, which inspired the events that led Callie to disobey Cain and the Moons. Next, the Hemlocks flower, actually a real flower, yes, which has the literal meaning of "you will cause my death." And finally, other things like the name of both gangs, which were created from Coley and I. Coley being the red moons from the blood moon that passes a few times a year, and mine being the North Star, symbolizing the guiding light it shines even in darkness. They even have roots back to the original names of the gangs, which were the Modfia and the Nodfia, allowing them to live on in spirit, though the official versions. Heck, even the time period was chosen by Kettles to be the year 1920, as that was the height of mafia gangs in the US and New York to combat against recent prohibition laws in 1919. Lots of little details were created out of sheer randomness in a moment of clarity, leading to a very messy but enjoyable project. Apart from the story, the way the characters were designed and written was also influenced by quite a few sources, which changes depending on who you talk to. Given how different each of the writers are in our team, I reached out to find what inspired them through their journey. So let's start our examples with Skylar McCarthy. As his writer, Moss took a lot of inspiration from music, listening to songs and seeing if the lyrics matched up with the character they're working on. Doing so allowed them to imagine scenes in their head that gave way to expanding on the character's backstory, lore, and journey. Animated media, on the other hand, played a similar part. For Sky, they cited Chief Bogo from Zootopia and Shere Khan from the Jungle Book remake as useful tools to design him around, noting a big help being both characters were voiced by McCarthy's voice claim, Idris Elba. Next up, we'll look into Chris Sanchez and his writer, Gamer. After joining the project through an invite from Kettles, they found that immigration during this time was a big deal to lots of people, showing Chris to be multilingual with mostly complete English. Wanting to smite down from the character creation heavens onto this poor little Cuban boy, Gamer pushed to make a fun, feral character that could fit well into the story and provide angst when needed most. Next up on our roster is Alexa Xavier, and the writer behind her, Cub. Alexa's character and design was heavily inspired by common tropes and AUs and other fandoms, referencing the villain Deku AU designs in Arcane as big inspirations. The simple vest and tie, gloves on the hands, a simple but worthwhile design that fit the vibe of the story in the earlier days. As we began to redesign our characters much later into the story-making process, Cub referenced work uniforms from the 1910s and 20s to fit into her workaholic personality, and to give off the impression that Alexa had yet to find herself in her life and was still being pushed around by those in power. When we reach the ending of the later acts and see more of Alexa's unique design and personality, we see her grow into the individual she has become, referencing wanting to show the tropes of strong, megalomaniac women not commonly seen in other media. And lastly, we have Callie and the writer behind her, yours truly. Since she began before I had time to grow into the persona I know and love today, a lot of her earlier designs took heavy inspiration from my own life and desires. She started out being drawn using references of myself and various outfits I enjoyed at the time, expanding her design further using popular outfits women wore during the 20s. As the story grew into more of a tangible piece of writing, I realized she lacked much of her own personality and design, and I would use references from workers' outfits in the 20s, drawings from Moss, and my own new affinity for anthro characters to bring you the Callie we know and love today. Lots of Callie's personality and backstory grew over time as I read other characters' stories and wrote the main story itself, given how integral her journey is in both the past and present of Hemlocks. Music did play a part here and there, but nothing I can specifically call out as an influence. And now that we've taken a look behind the curtain, so to speak, we begin to sing a different tune for this massive project, and look on for what's to come. Over these last two sections, we're going to explore the future of working on Hemlocks, and the projects that are being made from it. Are you ready? No? Well, too bad, we're going anyways. Well. What do we have here? I think some of you still think that this story is a completed project. Well, to burst your bubbles, no, it's not. You'd think after 2 years, but no, we're closer though. There's still a lot of stuff left in the project for us to do, and to finish up, to get it out to everybody. This is more of a, show it out to everybody, see what we have so far. But what is left in Hemlocks? As mentioned in the inspiration section, lots of small ideas come naturally as we work on the story here and there, but the big ones are the major milestones that need passing before we begin any future phases of the project. Also, due to the nature of this video and the time it's taken to complete it, it's very possible some of these pieces have already been answered by the time you're watching this, so if they have, I will make sure to show you what we've learned on screen. First up, we have the climax of Hemlocks. Major progress has made in connecting the beginning, middle, and end together, but the big finale of the story has yet to be figured out in any amount of detail. For a long time, the climax was thought to be the battle between the North and Cain with his allies, the one where Claire and Apollo die. But after a few sessions with Cub, more on that later, we discovered it fit much better as the middle's big event, leaving an empty gap where the climax will go. Next, we have the characters. Certain characters like Roy, Fern, and Mike have had some thought put into them, but are missing a few key details like a design, full backstory, and personality. As we go forward, more focus will be put onto their details and descriptions to help bring them up to everyone else's level. Side note, this doesn't mean to be interpreted as anything negative. Each writer works at their own pace and style, and some have been inactive for quite some time, so finalizing things like these are known to take time and effort, which we're well aware of and we work to support them through it. And lastly, we have the bunker. Ike's bunker of information is a key catalyst for the story beginning after his death, and there are lots of story elements tied to it, but there are a few details we still need to work out. To name a few, how does Eden play a role in its secrecy? What happens to the bunker at the end of the story? And is it ever found or used? Given how important this room is for the city in Hemlocks, it'll be an important thing to figure out as we move forward. And finally, our last section of the video, the future projects involving the wonderful world of Hemlocks. Despite the pieces still needed to get this story out of the drafting phase and into its writing phase, this video, among other things, serves as a huge milestone for the completion of that. It may not seem like much on the surface, but to get this project out to all of you, so much work had to be put in behind the scenes to get the story and its characters ready for this. Not even joking, Hemlocks didn't even have its name until I began the writing process back in August. It's been a long few months getting everything set up for this, but it hasn't just been me working on things. Let's talk about what else you can expect from the project in the coming future. First off is one you might not see very much of, but is very important to the future of this story, writers' meetings. Starting back in September, Cub and I began working together to set up weekly meetings to discuss the story and its outline, given how chaotic it can be without any direction taken. These meetings have helped us outline each character's journey, the arcs within it, and the big events that move the story onward. You most likely won't see very many of these publicly, if ever, but I couldn't go without giving her some of the credit she deserves, especially for all the effort she's put into this. I myself was the main organizer for a very long time, and having a second pair of hands to sort through a mess of Discord channels and documents is more helpful than you ever could imagine. So thank you, Cub. You mean a lot to me in this project. Next up, we have a very cool Hemlocks animation project in the works, being created by the wonderful Alice Devil. While no name has been assigned to it quite yet, it is planned to be a full animatic of the Hemlocks story to the song It Has Begun by Starset. Curious what it looks like? Well, it's actually been playing in the background this whole time. As the Hemlocks art tracker of the group, I've kept up with various versions and updates to the project as they've been made, and watching his journey through the process of making this reality has been mind-blowing and amazing. There's currently no release date in mind for the near future, but when it does, I would highly recommend you go watch it. It's got some amazing action in there. Next up, we have another unseen project you may not know of, the Hemlocks Art Drive. Back when we all started this in May of 2020, I realized the amount of art being made was, well, a lot. There were whips of drawings of characters and posters, even the occasional animatic. Keeping up with it all hadn't been thought of yet, as the project itself had only been around for a few days. So in a moment of what I can only consider pure genius, I set out to make a Google Drive to hold every piece of art made for the Mafia story on May 30th, working late into the morning of the 31st to complete the first ever dried update we'd see. Now, 2 years have gone by, and unsurprisingly, there have been a lot of Hemlocks art, and you've seen quite a bit of it already. The drive is the reason I've been able to show you all the past and current versions of the characters and interactions, as the story itself spanned from one server, now deleted, to its current one where we cast our ideas into. If you're curious what the count is as of this video's release, here's the number. Pretty impressive, right? I try not to give myself too much credit for most of the things here, as I usually work off of the wonderful ideas provided by the rest of the team. I'm simply one of the organizers, but the drive has been my biggest contribution so far, and keeping it up to date with everything is something I pride myself in, hoping it adds a bit of ease to the experience of working on Hemlocks. And finally, we have the Hemlock story itself. As mentioned before in the What's Left for Hemlocks, we've drawn closer and closer to getting this story worked out on an outline and character level, ready to draft out the beginning of what's to come next, but what does come next? Well, there are a few ideas floating in circulation. One idea is to plan out, write, and upload chapters of the story to AO3 in some sort of schedule or timeline, slowly building together a copy of the story in book form. Another idea is to produce the story through digital drawings, similar to comic pages, and upload them somewhere as well. To add on to it, each group of pages would slowly lead up to an animation for important scenes in the story. As we're still quite a few months out from that point of production, discussions on the medium are still very few and far between. Even ideas of merging the two together in some sort of hybrid style have been thrown out for us to ponder. However it happens though, you'll be able to count on me to keep you updated as that part of the project begins, so stay tuned for the future, everybody. Can you even believe it? We're actually near the... Sorry, 1 second. I think I'm getting a call. Yeah, hello, this is Mins. Yeah, I'm actually at the end of a video, can you believe it? Yeah, no, me neither. I didn't think it would ever end. What's that? You want people to like the video? Oh, you want people to subscribe to Min's the Mailbox and share around the video to see if anybody else would like to know about the project. That's a tall order, don't you think? That wasn't subtle at all, was it? I don't think it was. Well, hopefully you got a little laugh out of that. But unfortunately, we are actually near the end of the video. Over an hour of explaining a project that you've never heard of. It's pretty amazing, don't you think? When we started this project over 2.5 years ago, it was just a jumble of creative people trying to have a bit of fun, and now, well, that's mostly still the same actually, but besides that, we're now on the path to bringing our ideas out to you, out to the world, and I can't tell you how excited I am to finally be able to share something that's meant so much to me for so long. This video is a love letter to Hemlocks, to the time we've poured into the project, the long nights staying up understanding and sorting the pieces, to the brightest days and the quiet nights. This, in the simplest form, is my thank you. And oh, how many thank yous I have to give. Massive thanks, of course, goes to the Hemlocks team in its entirety for all your crazy, wonderful ideas that made this a reality, and for the most amazing friends I've made during this time. Another huge thank you to my friends not involved with the project for your support and patience. I can't count the number of times you had to listen to me trying to explain whatever I could about this story that probably didn't make much sense to you. The biggest of thank yous to everyone who's watching this right now, who's taking the leap to learn what in the world of Hemlocks even is, and I hope today I was able to answer that for you. And there's one thank you I have to do personally. Golly, you've been one of my best friends for nearly 2 years, over 2 years actually. You've been someone I could trust and rely on, somebody I could share ideas with that I never thought would be possible, and today is your birthday. When I made my first video in 2020, I made it my goal to release it on the 6-month anniversary, to show my love for the project and celebrate you, the person who made this whole thing even exist. And this year I'm doing the same, because for as much as this is dedicated to the love and work Hemlocks is built on, it's also dedicated to you, one of the most important people in my life that I can't thank you enough for everything you've given me. Happy birthday, Coley. I hope from the bottom of my heart that this can be my gift to you for everything you've done for me, for everything you've done for everyone. Here, you have been such an inspiration to us all. Humble beginnings. That's where we all start. Right at the beginning of our journeys, wanting to make something, to show ourselves to the world, to give them what we got. For some, it's a degree. For others, it's a job. And sometimes, given the right circumstances, it's a project. A story, an animation, a show, a comic. There's an infinite amount of ways a project can harness the creative powers held inside each and every one of us. Well, this is mine. No, our special project. A symphony of voices all chiming together to bring you a story of love, heartbreak, betrayal, and balance. This is our story, our Hemlocks, and I hope more than anything else that you enjoyed the ride. I've been Min's the Mailbox, and I'll see you on the other side. Thank you.